Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Into the Hemaverse, your guide for everything going on in the Hemaverse. As always, I am here with my co-hosts, David Rao
Hey.
and Nathan Graperes.
Hey.
I am, of course, Colin Vredenberg. I forgot that part at the beginning. Today we have a pretty special program. We've got Matt Easton of Scala Gladiatora. Whoa. I'm already off to a fantastic start. He's going to be here with us to talk about sabers just in just a few minutes. But first, we're going to do, as always, the news. The first thing I wanted to do on the news is to say, we have a Patreon. It's really cool. It's patreon.com/intothehemaverse. If you are into and able to support the show, we very much appreciate it. And I was going to give a quick shout out to our current Patreons, who are Freddie Hess of Sword to Sword Houston, Steve Andrides, who is a member of VAF, Dustin Collier, who used to be a member of VAF and is still a member of VAF in our hearts, Genevieve Frank, who is a member of VAF, and Black Dog Strength and Nutrition, who I'm actually not sure. But thank you all for giving your support. We very much appreciate it, and it's because of people like you that we can make this show better, get more guests, get more content out, and we actually have a really cool plan that we can't share yet of more content coming down the pipeline. Let's see. Speaking of which, it leads us actually into the AMA questions. So we are going to do a Ask Me Anything, an AMA. It will be live, still not scheduled, but we are working on that. We will make sure that everybody knows way in advance. We're trying to do one once a month. I think that's right.
Once a month, yeah.
Yeah, once a month. But scheduling is difficult, as you know. We're all we're returning to like activities and things like that, and also just trying to find a good time where you, our listeners, can also be present, like a weekend or Friday night, something like that. Anyway, we're working on it. But until then, please submit your questions as things that we could answer possibly on the AMA. It is going to be live, but we'd like to have like a backup list of questions that we can go to. And we'd like to hear just generally the kind of questions that our listeners are having. So the two ways that you can do that are, first, email us at intothehemaverse@gmail.com, or you can comment on this video and just say AMA question and then list your question, and that will help us immensely, and we'll get right to all of those.
Just make sure you do that before the AMA.
Yes. Well, if you don't do it before the AMA, then it will be tacked on to the next one.
See what you're doing there.
Yeah.
Clever.
Clever girl. So the next thing on the news is something that David wanted to share, which is the Michael Chittister's Hema bookshelf. Do you want to talk about that, David?
Yeah. So Mike Chittister has, some of you might be aware, he's runs Wicton Hour, which is basically like responsible for Hema being what it is today, because it's basically taking translations. I mean, it's not just translations, but it's just putting the actual treatises online, making translations available that otherwise don't exist. So it's been hugely influential in the growth of Hema. So he's been doing projects where he's doing like actual facsimiles of specific treatises, which I think we talked about this on the last episode. I think one of Nathan's students has the Paulhofer facsimile, and
I wanted one myself because it just looked way too cool.
yeah, like they're incredible. So I think his next one is Fiore,
Mhm.
and he's possibly hinted that maybe he's doing the Kushner next. So, anyways, it's you can go to facebook.com/
Hema Bookshelf.
Hema Bookshelf, right? Not the Hema Bookshelf. Hema
Yep,
Bookshelf.
that's it.
Yeah, so that's I think it's a great thing to support. Um, it's it's one thing to have, you know, a translation of a manual. It's another thing to have like an actual reproduction of the actual treatise itself. A lot of times people also don't realize like how big sometimes they are. Like some of the treatises, like they're like, I know like Paulus Call, I think the original is like massive.
Mhm.
Um, so it's kind of interesting when you see like a reproduction of the original, you're like, holy crap, it's so much different from what I was expecting it to look like.
Yeah, it's like one of those books that you see wizards having out on their tables in D&D games, where it's just like that big open fold, and it's really a great opportunity to own something like that, that we haven't had for years. So I would highly recommend it. Also, so the Talhofer Indiegogo is done. However, I think the publisher has stated that if you want both the Fiore and the Talhofer, you can get both with like basically there's an add-on charge. So if you're getting Fiore, you can, or the Flower of Battle, you can add on a certain the same amount and get the previous edition,
Yeah.
the previous offering as well, which I thought that was really cool. That is open to everybody. Yay! Nobody has to miss out. All right. Next thing on the news, we have been, well, specifically Mariana, who was a guest on Mariana Lopez. You can find her in Mariana Lopez Hema Coach on Facebook, and also the Fairy Gardener LLC. She's been struggling with some IP issues. Basically, there's a very disreputable t-shirt website called Moonchild Tee, and they have several other companies that are basically like offshoots of them who've been stealing her. Sorry.
I was gonna say the main one is actually Tipchi, I think.
T.
Yep.
Yeah,
TeeChip.
I think that's what it is.
They're like the overarching company, but then they have a bunch of like little subsidiary companies.
Right. So that basically they can pass on legal liability as they seem to see fit. Yeah, it's really terrible. But basically, what this website will do is take T-shirt designs from other people, not pay them, and not even get request permission to use them, and then sell them as T-shirts. So they've been doing this with fencing stuff recently, and one of Mariana's designs has been used without her permission, and that is really not cool. Besides being illegal stealing of intellectual property, it's also really not great. Please, please, please do not buy from them at all. If you want really cool Hema shirts, there are several ways to get it. Mariana has there's like a long list. David, do you have that list in front of you, actually?
Yeah. I can read it, or do we want to put it in the?
That's a good idea. I will just put that link in the description. That way we don't have to read it out.
Because there's a lot of things.
There is a lot.
Just to indicate kind of how crappy it is. So she actually sent them like a cease and desist letter, and sent proof that she owns the image. To which they responded saying that they were going to take down the image. So they took it. They responded back saying, "Hey, we took down the image from their website." And if you go to their website, the image is there, but it says like disabled, like you can't order it. And then you click on it, and it adds to cart, and you can check out and you can buy it.
Yeah, so like it'll like let you quick add to cart, but if you actually click on the thing, it's like oh, this has been removed. So
right. So
all semblances of
So rather than just removing it as requested, they're actually still on the website, And I know that it's still, as of a few days ago, they're still like having Facebook advertise featuring that image. There's also definitely other like fencing and Hema related designs there, and I guarantee that since there's actually we've been looking into it, there's like a whole lot like Jeff Dunham has like a lawsuit against them, and they're trying to get like a class action lawsuit going against them because basically they're just like stealing from designs from everyone.
Yeah, that's actually their business model. It's not like they do it kind of sometimes. Their business model is to steal and redistribute.
So
Nice.
if you are like a Hema artist designer who are sell T-shirts or anything like that, keep an eye out. You might want to check their website and see if your design is there. So.
Oh yeah, that's actually a good point. Whoa. Well, let's turn to a less serious topic. Well, I guess in past years it was also very serious because it's probably the sword that's killed the most people. And maybe I shouldn't say that. Has Saber killed the most people in all of the history of swords? Yes, no. What do we think?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I could see it.
I was just thinking Napoleonic Wars.
Potentially.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, so we're talking about Saber today. That's what this episode is about. And before we bring in our guest, I wanted to just broach with you guys your experience with Saber because mine is this much. Nathan, what's your experience with Saber?
I've sparred with it like twice.
So we're on the same page, you and me.
Yeah, no, I like whenever if I injure my right arm or my right hand or something like that, and I need to do something else, I'll like a single-handed weapon. I'll pick up Saber just for fun. I mean, I've done a bit more Dusok, which is somewhat similar, but not. It's similar in use, but very different than like the actual practice of military saber.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Everything is Dusok. Everything is Dusok. David, what's your experience with Saber?
And I probably have the most experience. So
as usual,
I work at a fencing school, so I've been exposed to sport saber forever. So I know that and have a rudimentary kind of understanding of sport fencing saber. But I've also done some like classical saber and like classical Italian saber. And I've started just recently working with a late 19th century saber treatise. So the Louis Rondel is the name. But I'm looking to kind of branch out into more sources, and that's one of the things I'm actually excited to talk with Matt about today is where to go from here.
Yeah, honestly, the fact that our tiny little channel has been able to get such a prolific and well respected Hema voice from YouTube, such as Matt Easton, is really amazing. I actually can't wait. So maybe we should just bring him on in. What do you think, guys?
Yeah.
Good.
All right. Well, coming up next, Matt Easton. Right, so today we have with us Matt Easton, a man who needs very little introduction. He is the founder of Scala Gladiatora, the historical fencing school, and the extremely popular YouTube channel. He's also a researcher, a teacher, and lecturer on arms and armor. Matt, welcome to the program. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you are here today to talk about sabers, but before we get into that, I have to ask you the same question that we ask everybody on this program, which is, how did you get into Hema?
Right. Okay. That's it's kind of a big question. I guess I was always from the earliest age I can remember. I was pretty much obsessed with history and swords and armor and everything like that. So I don't really remember when I started being obsessed with that stuff, but I always was. So when I was a teenager, I dabbled a little bit in reenactment, and I also started modern fencing. So I was very lucky that when I was at school, they literally started doing modern fencing foil. While I think when I was about 15, 16 at school, so I did a beginner's course in foil. And we had a really good coach, and that led on to me fencing recreationally. I never really competed at university as well. At the same time that I was doing that at university, I also started doing kung fu. So I was doing these three things all together. I was doing kung fu, modern fencing, and a little bit of reenactment as well. But in addition to that, I kind of already had the Hema mindset, as it were. I was already kind of looking for source material. I was an archaeology student, so I was already kind of like deep in historical source material. And I was obsessed with armor as well. And in fact, I wrote my degree dissertation on 14th century armor. And nice. So I kind of wanted to do Hema before I knew Hema was a thing. And then one day I was reading a martial arts magazine, which I think was Martial Arts Illustrated, which is a UK magazine. And there was an article in there on Elizabethan swordsmanship. And of course, like my brain exploded. I was like, what? This is a thing. And it was a guy called Terry Brown, who lots of people will have heard of, I guess. And this was 1997. So I got straight in contact with him, read the article like 5 times over, got in contact with him, and ended up training with Terry for a couple of years. So that was basically how I got into Hema. I was already kind of wanting to do Hema before I knew that Hema was a thing. And then I found out about Hema, and I was very lucky. I was kind of, if not the first wave, I was kind of the second wave maybe of people coming into historical European martial arts before it was called Hema, incidentally. We're not really sure what we called it back then. I think we probably called it WMA, West Martial Arts. Yeah. And Terry had been researching this stuff for probably 2 decades up until that point, and just kind of, he was a kung fu instructor and practitioner of many, many decades of experience. And I think he'd been on the British Kung Fu Council or something like that. He was quite sort of high up in certain spheres, but he'd completely branched off and started focusing on the European stuff. So, I was very lucky to be in the right place in London at the right time in the late 90s. And a lot of us in the UK who ended up running clubs, people like Rob Lovett, Milo Thurston, people like this, we all trained with Terry at some point, and we all met each other training with Terry. I was obsessed with medieval period, so principally the reason I branched off, in fact, initially with the Exiles with Rob Lovett, was because I wanted to do medieval stuff. So I was, it was great doing George Silver, and other British backsword stuff for a couple of years. But I really, really wanted to do, at that time, I really, really wanted to do longsword and sword and buckler and poleaxe and all of those things. So we basically branched off, and Rob Lovett had spent a long time running a reenactment group called the Exiles, which he wanted to turn into a Hema club. And so he invited me to come, and I became co-director of the Exiles with Rob. And we did that for about a year, and then I branched off. They were on completely the other side of London. London's a pretty big city, so it was quite a long commute for me. And I ended up founding my own group, which became Schola Gladiatoria in West London. And the rest is history.
Cool. Yeah, I think a lot of us kind of come from either a sport fencing background, or I've actually, now that I've been meeting some of our guests, a lot of the early adopters, like the wave 1 and 2 people, came from Eastern martial arts, but you kind of came from both, which is it's just interesting to me.
And I should also, I know that in the US, a lot of the first wave of Hema people came from an SCA background, but the SCA has never really been a thing in the UK. So, we have reenactment, we have fencing, we have Asian martial arts. So, and I did all of those things. if SCA had been available, I probably would have tried that as well. But it's not to say there isn't SCA in the UK. There is, but it's very, very small. And this, I think it's probably bigger now than it was 20 years ago. But back then, there were very few people doing it.
I think I was talking to somebody about this recently, and they said that basically in the UK, it's not SCA. It's just reenactment groups is like the equivalency of it, which I thought was very interesting because SCA they also hold tournaments and stuff, and they have their own stuff, but it's very interesting. Let me just ask though, because I think we all kind of want to know the YouTube channel. How did that come about?
So I was a watcher of YouTube, a viewer back in I guess that must have been. How long have I been doing this? About 7 years I've been doing this seriously. So I guess it was about 2011, 2012. And I started following certain channels that talked about history a lot. And some of those channels started talking about Hema. And by that point, I'd already been running my club for 10 years. I'd taught all over Europe and, been competing and that kind of stuff. And I kind of felt that some of the way that they were representing Hema, or the things that they were saying, which some of it was just flat out wrong, or some of it just I disagreed with. I felt that kind of like, well, if they're starting to talk about Hema, why don't I just talk about Hema as someone who actually runs a Hema club and has been doing this for a while? And so, I don't hide the fact that the person who probably inspired me to start my channel more than anyone else was Lindy Beige. Yep. Who I now know as an individual Lloyd, and we've done videos together and stuff. But he came from, funnily enough, a very similar background to me in that he studied, I think, either classics or either archaeology or anthropology. I can't remember, but he studied something similar to me at university. But he's a bit older than me, and bizarrely, he's actually from the exact same part of London as me as well. We grew up in the same part of London, but then he moved up to the northeast of England, to Newcastle, and studied up there, and I stayed in London. So it's funny, if things had been a bit different, our paths might have crossed earlier on. But basically, Lloyd makes great videos and knows tons of stuff, especially about tanks, World War II tanks. But I felt that some of the things he was saying about Hema were basically, if not flat out wrong, they were kind of poorly informed. And he is a Hema practitioner. He does train with Bob Brooks's group up near Newcastle, or in Newcastle, I think. But at that point, kind of like almost 10 years ago, his understanding of Hema was maybe much more kind of basic. So yeah, that was I just kind of thought, well, I actually remember coming back from fight camp. I think it must have been in about 2012. And Scott Brown was in my car. And I was talking to Scott, and I was saying to him, Scott, there's, YouTube's growing really fast. And there's people, a lot of us, I had a channel, but we just put like sparring footage and stuff like that, a bit of test cutting. I didn't make like, informational videos really. And I said to him, people are starting to make videos. People with big channels are starting to make videos about Hema. Like, it should be Hema people making channels, making videos about Hema. So I remember, and one of the first videos I filmed was with my then baby daughter, who's now 7-year-old, strapped to my chest in a castle on the way back from fight camp, and with Scott Brown. So yeah.
I will say, for our listeners, if you haven't seen, I think it was one of your first videos that you did a collaboration with Lindy Beige, but the spear video is probably one of the best Hema videos on YouTube ever made. It's basically just like, hey, why was spear a good thing that was used in every culture? And then you test it in a way that makes sense. All the spears versus the swords, and spears just keep winning.
So it's interesting. Spears and Lindy Beige and me have an interesting relationship, because Lloyd's made a number of videos about spears, and it's one of the subjects that I disagree with him the most on. And I am constantly getting messages from people, both Hema people and non-Hema people, saying, you've got to make a new video about spears because Lloyd said this about spears and he's wrong and you've got to set him straight. So it's funny because we come at it from different perspectives, and something I guess that everyone realizes at some point is a lot of the time a subject isn't about right and wrong. It's actually about you're coming at it from completely different perspectives, and it's trying to find, okay, why do you think X? Why do I think Y? Okay, it's because we're thinking in completely different contexts, to use one of my favorite words. And so, Lloyd's background is from reenactment and I think a bit of LARP. My background's obviously from Hema. That changes a huge number of things, especially with spears. And something that I have encountered a lot with reenactors is a lot of reenactors that I've met have a lack of respect for spears, because certainly in UK reenactment, they can't stab at faces. So what you can do with a spear in a reenactment context, because people are wearing historically correct headgear with an open face or no helmet, so all of their thrusts have to be quite down low. When if they're using shields, if they're like Viking era reenactors, then the spear isn't very potent anymore. Whereas in a Hema context with a fencing mask on, where you can bam someone straight in the fencing mask, it completely changes your respect for the spear. So yeah, there's many different, we come from different backgrounds, so that's part of it. But I think also we've also seen the same evidence and come to slightly different conclusions as well. And that's, you've got to accept that will always happen as well. Two people can have the same perspective and the same evidence and still come to different conclusions. So, where we disagree is partly about whether the spear is good in one-on-one combat versus group combat and things like this. I would also just, I know this is a tangent.
No, it's okay.
Spears are, I think, a really understudied subject, and they need to get more love. But
I would agree.
one of the other things that really changed my perspective of spears overall was I took part in a tournament in Florence inItaly about 6 years ago, something like that. And in that tournament, it was a random weapon assignment, and it was in fact the most fun tournament I've ever fought in, because you didn't know what weapon set you were going to be assigned. They'd literally spin a thing or flip a card, and they'd go, okay, you've got sword and buckler, you've got longsword. And it was great because you had to, on the spot, even if you weren't very experienced with something, you had to just kind of do the best you could with that weapon set. And you might be at a disadvantage or you might be at an advantage. And it just changed the whole psychology of everything. But one of the things that really made a big impact on me, literally, was the fact that spears were allowed to be thrown. And I realized in that tournament, if you allow the combatants to throw their spears, it changes everything about the spear fight. Because if you know that at any second, that person holding that spear might just launch it at you, then it changes how you fight. It changes how you hold your shield, if you've got a shield. It changes everything, So
I'm so glad you went off on that tangent, because there is a fantastic video of David throwing a sword at me and nailing me dead center mask, and I have never fenced against him the same way ever again.
Yeah.
I promise you. I 100% agree.
And it's sad about that, because the funniest part about this is it was literally a joke. Like, I don't know, I was like a good 10 feet away from you at least.
Yeah.
Like, well out of distance. And I've got a side sword, and I just kind of jokingly throw it forward, fully expecting it to fall short and just land on the floor, and just kind of like as a joke. And I nail him right in the face.
So the amazing thing was, I thought it was, when he started to do it, I was like, is he thrusting me from a mile away? Yeah. What is he doing? And then when the sword leaves his hand, I didn't even notice. So I had no reason to defend against it. I was just like, haha, I'm way out of measure for this. And then when it hits you in the face, it's such a, oh no.
And that connects as well. Going back to the spear, there's a lot of debate online about overhand grip or underhand grip, and there's a lot of people who kind of say that overhand grip is just stupid. And I've made quite a few videos basically kind of explaining why I think overhand grip was actually, certainly if we look at the historical artwork, it was the most prevalent used with a shield. And part of that is because if you've got a shield here, it's about coming over the shields and this kind of stuff. But part of it is also throwing. And, an underhand grip one-on-one, if you're not going to throw the spear, might be a little bit, most people can kind of use the spear with more force and for longer like that. but you if you want to throw it, you've kind of got to switch around to the other grip before you can throw it. So I think it's quite a complex topic, and again, that's one of the ones where I disagree with Lloyd. Like he doesn't like the overhand grip at all, whereas I think my attitude's a little bit different. It's kind of like, well, I'm not going to be like the best modern spearman. I'm going to try and do what they did and understand why they did that, because they probably knew what they were doing. So I kind of put more trust in history and archaeology, and I guess that runs through a lot of the things I do. Is that I kind of view Hema as a kind of trying to find the truth in the reconstruction of the art rather than trying to invent something new. And sometimes that means that I do rub up against other people in Hema, because for a lot of people in Hema, I think it's a very modern movement, and they're happy to sort of create everything new, whereas I'm kind of trying to keep it more original.
Yeah, actually, I think you'll find nothing but friends here in that perspective. To me, it's definitely we look at the historical evidence of how things were used, and we try to build what they had. And I'm not much for let's try to build something new. So that's
Well,
go ahead.
Our previous episode, we were talking with Chuck Gross about strength training and conditioning for Hema, and one of the topics that came up was historical methods and how they're not necessarily good by modern sports, medicine understanding, but if you're actually interested in training the way that they trained, right? Like, do you want to train in a modern way, or do you want to try to replicate how they were exercising, what they were doing to achieve that fitness? And it was a very, very interesting discussion.
Yeah, and it's also tricky because we have to concede at the same time that some things that they believed and some things that they did were technically wrong, like their understanding of what steel was, and really fundamental things, and obviously a lot of their medical understandings were wrong, or just maybe much more basic than ours, but at the same time, in terms of the arts that we practice, I guess there's a certain amount to be said, I think, for looking at movement styles and body mechanics, and someone like Roland Vorcheka, I would never say that I agree with all of Roland's theories, but they're fascinating, and I'm really glad that he's doing that kind of work and putting that stuff out there. And Roland did a really popular video that went viral about like medieval people walking a certain way and how that would affect, and I'm not saying that I agree with necessarily everything he said, but it's fascinating stuff to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hate to move the conversation along, but we were supposed to talk about sabers. But so we all kind of have a little bit of experience with saber, but not a lot. And I was going to just start it off with basically, you're kind of, Matt, you're kind of known for being a saberist. First, how much of that is true? And B, or second, how did that come about? Was it just personal interest, or was it the channel? Please elaborate.
So it's sort of complex, and I suppose it starts out from one thing, and that is that I started collecting antique swords when I was in my late teens. I think I was about 16 or 17 when I managed to get my first real antique sword. I had a fake antique sword when I was about 15 and found out it was a fake, and then I got a real antique when I was about 16, 17. And I think throughout, from then onwards, one of the things that I've loved about sabers is that they're one of the types of historical sword that you can actually, or a lot of people can afford to buy. And not many people can afford to go and buy an original 15th century longsword because they start at about £5,000 and they go up from there. And if you want to get a sword, for example, from the Dordogne find, some of which I've held, I've been lucky enough to hold some of those, and they've been up in auction. They sell for like 25,000 to 50,000. So they're huge amounts of money. And yeah, so I love the fact that it is a type of sword, whether it's sabers or spadroons, but this kind of the industrial era, as I'd call it, where you can actually get your hands on the originals, and there's quite a lot of them around. They're not uncommon. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I've always loved about so I was a complete medievalist, really, until I was probably in my late 20s, maybe about 30. And one of the things genuinely that switched me on to studying Saber, there were two things, and I'll come to the second thing in a minute. One of the things was that I had been studying medieval history and medieval archaeology since I was at school. So I did what we call A-levels, which are the exams you do when you're 18. I did medieval history as one of those three. And then I went on to do medieval history and archaeology at university. And I'd been so consumed with medieval history in the medieval world. And then I did medieval Hema as well, and Fiore principally. We did the first English translation of Fiore. And I've been so consumed with medieval stuff that I kind of got to a point where I felt like I was running out of source material. And the problem with the medieval world is we just don't actually have a lot of written primary sources for it. Even if you study something huge, like a big historical important event like the Battle of Hastings, you only have about 8 historical sources of the period talking about that campaign. It's tiny. Whereas when you look at the 19th century, there are just thousands and thousands and thousands of newspaper articles, journals, books, diaries, all sorts of stuff. There's so much to draw upon. So it was partly a desire, I think, to have more to consume and more to read, and the 19th century gave me more historical material to dive into. But then the other reason I got more heavily into Saber was that I'd been doing principally longsword, but also dagger and spear and poleaxe and related weapons, but principally longsword. I've been doing for quite a lot of years in Hema, and I was averagely good, I guess, at my height, but I was never a great longsworder. And I dabbled, I guess, like lots of people do when you do Hema and you focus on one weapon, you dabble in other weapons. And I'd studied, I'd done modern sport fencing, and I did a couple of years of backsword, which is pretty similar to Saber fundamentally, with Terry Brown. And I started dabbling in sparring and then in competition with Saber, and basically I was better at it. And sometimes what you end up doing is what you're good at, not necessarily. I would have loved to have been an amazing. So one thing I really had an idea I wanted to be good at was sword and buckler, and I've just never been good at sword and buckler. I'm just not good at it. And sometimes you just have to accept. You can still do something, you can still enjoy it, but. And Saber for me was. So I got to a point, I think, when I'd taught at quite a lot of events around Europe in the early 2000s. Where I felt a lot of competition stress going into longsword tournaments, because I felt like I had to kind of like defend my name, my reputation, whatever, or the fact that I was an instructor. And I found it intensely stressful entering longsword tournaments. So I started I started entering single stick and saber tournaments, because at that time I had no reputation to lose in that. I had nothing. No one they thought of me at that time as a Fiore instructor. So I could enter these backsword tournaments and stuff, or single stick tournaments, and just have fun. So for me, it was kind of like like more getting back to enjoying the Hema and not having to feel like I was trying to maintain a reputation or something. And perhaps because I was more relaxed, or perhaps because I'm just better with one-handed swords than two-handed swords, I did better at it as well. And just, gradually I just became more, I fell more and more in love with Saber, partly because of the history, because of the amount of historical source material I could consume, partly because I could get my hands on the antiques, and partly because I was actually, relatively speaking, better at it than I was at longsword. But during that whole period, I've always taught Fiore. So Fiore was what I started the club teaching, and I still alternate each week between Victorian sources and 15th century sources. And over the years, I've branched out a little bit from Fiore. I do a little bit of Vardy, and I bring in some German stuff as well, because over the years I've taught alongside, and I've always known people like David Rawlings and Scott Brown and Matt Gallas and various other people who are proper sort of, or certainly were proper sort of German longsword aficionados, or 133 aficionados or whatever. So I've kind of absorbed some of that. So I've got enough that I can teach the basics in my classes of some Lichtenauer and, you know, some Vardy and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would say that it's really difficult, and I'm not experienced, but from what I see from instructors and people I know, it seems to be very difficult to get away from longsword because longsword is so popular. But I can definitely understand the tournament pressure on somebody who is known for something. Like, oh man, are people gonna think that I'm a hack if I don't like make top 8 or something? Like, what?
Do you know what's funny though is that I do get the competition. So I mean, I haven't competed since Long Point 2016 actually, when there was the Saber Invitational. Mostly just because I haven't really had time. I haven't really been going to many events, having kids and this kind of stuff. But also I think I've lost the appetite for it. I don't have. I used to have the hunger. You know, I wanted to win things. I wanted to try and, you know, get a reputation or whatever. And I just don't really care anymore. I just want to do. You know, I just want to learn stuff and have fun and this kind of stuff. But I still. Luckily, I've got several people in my club who are very competent and win loads of stuff, and so I fence with them loads and I train them and all this kind of stuff. So I live vicariously through them now. They compete for me. But what was I going to say? Yeah, I do still have some degree of nerves if I were to compete, and up until when I was still competing in Saber. But I think I was always more confident with Saber than I was with longsword. So, you know, for example, at Long Point, it was an invitational, but, you know, there were some great fencers there. There was Jake, there was Christopher Stanson, there was Tees, and I fenced Tees a couple of times in tournament. I'd never fenced Christopher Stanson before, which was very interesting, and I'd never fenced Jake before, which was also very interesting, but I'm just more confident with Saber. So I didn't feel the nerves as much because I felt more confident in my abilities.
So you talked a little bit about the there being just more everything for later sources, and particularly Saber as one of the things that drew you to it. So in that case, what kind of texts and training material exists for Saber? And which ones do you work with personally?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first, if I may. So,
Sure, yeah.
so I mostly work with John Musgrave Waite's manual, Lessons in Saber, and also Alfred Hutton's works. But most people, when you say Hutton, think of Cold Steel, and I'm not particularly a fan of Cold Steel for various reasons. That's what I regard as his sport fencing manual. Not that there's anything wrong with sport fencing, but it's a bit different to his other manuals. So Hutton's earlier stuff, and bizarrely his later stuff, is a bit more geared towards the military. And in my opinion, Cold Steel is geared towards civilian fencing clubs and sport. And he says at the beginning of the Cold Steel that this is for the light saber, and that it's inspired by certain Italian works. Nothing against Italian saber here, but so it's a step out from what his normal kind of trajectory. And in fact, Hutton's last kind of real saber book is probably the most combative, the most kind of the most Hema, actually. He draws on material from Alfieri, Marozzo, George Silva. He's got closing and grappling. He uses the pommel. He does stuff in that manual which you don't find in very many other saber manuals at all. So and he's literally talking about being in Afghanistan and fighting for your life against a tribesman. You know, it's kind of warfare stuff, not kind of fencing style stuff. John Musgrave Waite is an interesting contrast to that, in that his stuff is kind of a bit more fencing style, but he himself was a career soldier. Although he never went on campaign, he joined the military at about 18, 20 years old, and he served right the way through for like 25 years in one of the most respected cavalry regiments, the Horse Guards, the Second Life Guards. And then he became a fencing instructor after that, kind of like when he was relatively old for that period, in his 40s, mid 40s, I think. So yeah, they're kind of contrasting, and they're not the same as well. They're related systems. And so you asked me about the what material there is for studying Saber.
Mm-hmm.
And there is tons and tons and tons. I don't factually know whether this is correct, but I suspect that there are more Saber manuals than maybe manuals for any other weapon. Off the top of my head, I can't think what there might be more. I mean, obviously there's a fair number of rapier treatises, and there's a good number of small sword treatises, but there's really a lot of Saber material. And one of the things which is great about Saber is pretty much every major sort of political or national or linguistic grouping has Saber manuals. So you can study Spanish ones. You can, from all over the South American, Mexican, Spanish, you've got Portuguese, then you've got German manuals, you've got Austrian manuals, you've got British manuals, French manuals, Italian manuals, Russian, Ironically, one of the only things that we don't really have any manuals for is Polish. And the Polish saber, and that's something that. So nothing against Polish saber fencing, but I do, as I've said, pointed out on my channel a few times, I find it slightly ironic that Polish saber has such a big following when it's one of the saber systems with the least amount of primary source material.
So I would say it's somewhere Richard Marsden is like, oh, and a little tear runs down his face.
Well, the thing is, and I'm good friends with Jerzy, who's one of the leading Polish proponents of Polish saber fencing, and there is source material definitely, and you can, they have absolutely shown that you can reconstruct something from the source material that there is. And drawing on certain Marstelli's saber, which seems to be showing an Eastern European opponent, or perhaps Turkish, it's difficult to say. And then you've got some certain German treatises talk about certain details of Polish saber. So there is source material, but there isn't a manual for it. And we do have one Polish saber manual from the 1830s, I think it is. I can never say the name. I think it's like Stastovsky or something like that. But it's a bit unusual because what he's trying to do is he's trying to, even in the 1830s, he's trying to reconstruct old style Polish saber from the 1600s. So it's kind of like almost already Hema in the early 19th century by that point. But
we actually got to meet Jerzy. He was at the very last United States tournament that has happened. It was, I think, March. It was the Arnold Fencing Classic.
I know. Yeah.
So he came, and David and I went. That was my first experience ever with an actual saber tournament, and really a saber class as well. Obviously David has more experience than I do, but yeah, he was a really cool guy, and we seemed to get along all right. He didn't like the light sabers, probably for a very good reason, that he wanted it to be more military saber than sport saber, I would say. Okay. So yeah, he
had a problem with some of the people using lighter like dueling blade, more like sabers, rather than like the heavier military kind of style saber.
I will say though, to his credit, he said, "Oh, that's the saber you're using. Then I'll go get my light one as well." And I was "That's fair. That's fair."
So to my everlasting shame, I was once fencing in a tournament at the Royal Armouries, actually in Leeds, and they allowed 3 different weapons you could use. One was a small sword. One was a dueling saber, so in other words, a really light, like a pecoraro type saber, and the other was at the time, a Hanway Hutton. We didn't have a lot of saber choices back in those days. And I'd never used a pecoraro before, but I usually used the Hutton at that time. And I looked at what people were using, and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to use this. If I can use the blade, if I can use the blade which is lighter, quicker, and longer, that's the one I'm going to use. So I borrowed one and won the tournament with it, but I felt really cheap doing that.
It's like, oh yeah, I feel so bad, and that gold medal is just still sitting on the wall.
But one of the things I love about Jersey is he's very pure to his system, and so he comes to fight camp pretty much every year since he started coming about 5 years ago, and he does his system, and even though that system is maybe not the best thing to be using in that kind of environment against those swords with those rules, he stays true to his system. So he doesn't do what I did, and he doesn't switch out for but interestingly, in the last couple of years, he started studying some Austrian saber, later military saber, which is more similar to the British and French and other stuff that you normally see used in tournament. And he's a very, very good fencer, so he can now switch between these two styles, and he'll pick the sword depending on, and sometimes he'll pick the sword and the system depending on who his opponent is.
I mean, that's probably very advantageous. But so actually that brings up a question that I had, because there's so much material. What would you say, is there a real difference between a lot of them, or is it maybe just much of the same with very small differences here and there?
Stole my question, you jerk.
Oh, sorry.
So what I would say is it's a little bit like languages, in that some of them are interrelated, more or less so, and some of them are barely not related. But they all have a fundamental root, I suppose. So there are fundamental fencing principles which obviously run through all of them. And if you look at British and French saber fencing, then for the most part it shares a lot of similarities, and that's for historical reasons, that the British system of saber fencing owes a lot to what they were doing in France. On a fundamental level, they owe a lot to small sword method as well. They're all based on, not all, but most are based on lunge and recover. Right foot, dominant foot forward, and you lunge with an attack, and you recover back to guard. And that's a kind of fundamental across most of the saber systems, although not all of them. That being said, there are some fundamental differences between some of the systems. So, for example, if we look in Italy up until about the 1860s, what they were doing in Italy was very similar to what was being done in France and Britain to some extent. But then after the 60s, 70s, they became very influenced by the Radelli school. And the Radelli school does a few things very differently. And I won't go into full list, but one of the things that the Radelli school does that's different is they cut from the elbow. Okay, so British and French, I'm trying to get my hand in shot. British and French cut essentially from the wrist with a turn, with a moulinet. Whereas the Italians after Radelli, but not before Radelli, cut from the elbow with an elbow moulinet. And so the reasoning, as I understand it, the reasoning for this is because Radelli and the people who followed that school argued that this made for a more powerful cut. But it means you have to time the movement of the hand with the lunge differently, because you have to start the movement of the arm before you start the lunge, so they arrive at the same time. Because if you don't do that, what you're doing is you're exposing your forearm to a stop cut. Whereas in the British sources, they're very precise about the fact that you must lunge and do the wrist rotation at the same time, and not create an opening to be able to cut your arm and stop the incoming attack. So there's a divergence of philosophies. And then if we go to Spanish saber, and when I say Spanish, I mean the whole Spanish-speaking world, because they were all influenced by Spanish fencing methods, so Mexico and lots of South American countries. They are influenced by destreza. So destreza rapier methods literally were carried through into some saber, but not all of it. And you can find some Spanish saber that looks pretty much like French saber. But you can find some other Spanish saber. In fact, there's a very good Mexican manual. I can't remember. It could be Morello. I can't remember the author. It's very clearly based on destreza principles. So, and then there's a Russian manual I'd love to see a translation of one day, because they literally have different system for different types of saber. So they have a system for the straight-bladed palash, as they call it, which looks quite like Anglo-French method. But then they have a completely different system for the curved saber, like some of the ones behind me over that way. And they, for the very curved saber, they use countercutting like Polish saber does. So they've got, even just within one manual, they've got two different systems depending on whether you've got a long straight blade or a shorter curved blade.
Interesting. And it's funny when you were talking about that, specifically, I thought that's fascinating, by the way, the cutting from the wrist or the elbow, specifically because one of the few manuals that I've really studied is Fabris, who talks about specifically that, cutting from the wrist or the elbow or the shoulder, and each of them having a different time, the wrist being quicker but lighter, and I love the interconnectedness of all of these things, which is why
it even gets more, you get into the minutiae, it gets even more complicated, because even within the systems that cut from the wrist, there are differences in them as well. So for example, if we look at the earlier for example Taylor and the 18th century backsword stuff, they'll actually cut, I'm trying to get my hand in a shot, they'll cut directly from the wrist with a kind of snap cut, quite similar to what's seen in modern sport fencing, which is a less powerful cut in general. It depends obviously where you start with the hand, but it's usually a less powerful cut, but it's obviously more direct and creates no openings whatsoever. And this makes a lot of sense when you're using a big basket hilt as well. So a lot of the backsword and broadsword systems, they hold the basket out pretty much like a buckler in front of the sword arm and in front of the body.
Makes perfect
and
sense.
they do these, and they have the hand up quite high. So if you look at Zachary Wilde, for example, he has the hand very high, and then just basically snap cuts down. And it can be very powerful, powerful enough to do the job. Whereas if you go into Hutton and Burton and things like this, you've pretty much always got the French moulinet, so you make a circle from the wrist, which gives you the generation of power. So even just within the wrist rotation cuts, you've got variation there.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Because I've been trying to kind of dive into Saber a little bit, and sometimes it can be not having a great understanding of it yet. Like reading some of the systems, is when they describe the moulinet, sometimes I'm not entirely sure whether it's describing an action that's more like that or more of a almost in the air type action like that. But I think they both exist, don't they?
Yeah, they're just different. They're different numbers of moulinet. Yeah, so essentially a moulinet. So for anyone listening who doesn't know, moulin is just French for windmill. So moulinet means little windmill, or in Italian molinello means little windmill. It's just, so it just means a circle. Right. So it doesn't really matter whether you're doing a horizontal cut around here, or a horizontal cut around there, or an upwards cut. If you're doing some type of circular motion to charge and power the cut, that's a moulinet.
Interesting.
Source-wise, so I mean, much like you, I started with longsword and then have branched out from there. And actually, I know you mentioned about sword and buckler. It was actually funny because I decided that I wanted to learn about sword and buckler, and then I was like, well, everyone's always talking about 133, so let me start there. And I worked with that for a while and then realized this is just there's not enough here for me to feel like I really know what I'm doing. So I kept like progressively moving forward until I got to the Bolognese system, and then it was very satisfying because there's such a profound number of texts that you can work from. So it's much more satisfying and feeling like I'm actually understanding and doing what I'm actually supposed to be doing.
I personally think that Bolognese sword and buckler is easier than 133 as well, because they're having the buckler out there and then basically doing things around it. And sometimes obviously they come together some of the time, but it seems George Silver talks about, and I'm not a student really I'm not a scholar of Silver, but as I understand it, he talks about the fact that there are two ways of using the sword and buckler: one where you keep them together and one where you sort of keep them apart. And I kind of almost think that kind of almost describes 133 and Bolognese.
Yeah. So, but from there, I've then really developed an interest in one-handed weapons. And that's partially, a lot of that is because I just don't like the long, even though I do longsword, I just don't like it as much as I like single-handed weapons. But also I've had a number of like injuries that have made longsword harder for me to do in a way that I feel like I feel like I can fence to the level where, you know, I'm comfortable doing it. So I've been working a lot more and trying to dive into Saber. Prior to that, my only experience with Saber was because I coach at a modern fencing school. So I'd done some modern Saber, but I've also done a little bit of like classical Saber. And I've started reading Louis Rondel's Foil and Saber. Um, how much of that Saber is, I guess, a question for you? How much I'm assuming you've read Rondell.
So I haven't studied it, but I have read bits of it. Yes.
So I guess the question is, how much of what he's teaching there is just sport fencing, and how much of it is more of a military? Because it's hard.
So I think it's
hell, because it doesn't feel purely sport.
No, I think absolutely, and it's in that I can't remember the date of it. It's about 1890, I think.
90, I think, yeah.
It's in that kind of bridging period, and so technically, sports saber didn't really exist yet.
Right.
I would say that modern sports saber didn't really exist until the 1904 Olympics, probably, when they basically devised the rules and they changed the weapon. They made the weapons lighter and this kind of stuff. And they also did away with leg cuts. And before that, you find leg cuts are pretty much, certainly in Britain, are pretty much normal. But Louis Rondel, as from my reading of it, is similar to Waite. It's just a little bit. It's like a decade later, basically. So it is. It's for the Sal and it's just to use the saber, and I don't think they separated the two things at that point. But yeah.
So that's been my starting kind of point, but I'm looking to branch out into more. So I guess your recommendation would be Waite would be the next step.
Waite is definitely worth reading. The downside of Waite is that he doesn't really describe some of the real basics. So for someone coming new to Saber, I would never recommend Waite initially. I'd recommend either one of Hutton's works, for example, The Swordsman, which is very good, or I'd recommend there is a manual by Alanson Wynne and what's his name? Can never remember the other guy's name. Woolley something. But anyway, Alanson Wynne. So it's interesting because it's a small manual, but it's very concise and actually gives you all of the basics. And it's actually two manuals. It's actually a manual on how to use the saber and a manual on how to use the single stick. And obviously, so single stick was kind of the sport fencing version of the saber, but they obviously interconnect quite a lot. And what's interesting is in the introduction to that, they actually talk about the fact that everything we learned here was learned at Waite's club in Waite's rooms with many hours with the sting of the ash plant, kind of thing. So they talk about fighting for long time at Waite's club. So there's an interconnection there between Waite and that manual as well, and that manual describes the basics very concisely and well, I think, even on how to hold the saber actually. And it's surprising how few manuals talk about that, and they very, very clearly say basically, if you find the saber relatively light for you, then stick the thumb up the back, and if you find the saber a bit heavy for you, then hold it in a hammer grip or a handshake grip. And that's it. That's all you need to know. Actually, it's really super simple. But very few other manuals actually state that.
So I am very intimately familiar with like French smallsword. Like I've been working with that for I don't know over a decade now. How much of that will be of use in
100% of it, yeah, all of it. So you literally, so there are accounts of French officers, military officers, getting into duels, and it was a certain convention to use, if you were an officer, to use the sword of your rank and of your branch of the service. And there are literally accounts where they say, well, they didn't really know how to use the saber, but they were good fencer. And often when they say fencer, they mean foil and small sword. And so they just used the saber like a big heavy small sword. And there's even one account that says, because of the curve of the saber, he says they held the sabers backwards so that the curve was like a foil to assist with the thrust in terse. So yeah, I mean, but the everything you learn in foil and small sword, you can apply to saber. The only thing which is more difficult is, depending on the type of saber you're using, is the added mass and where the sort of center of gravity is of the saber. So famously, a lot of saber manuals, they talk about the circular parry, which is just so normal, obviously, for foil and small sword. And they basically say circular parries don't work very well with sabers, partly because they're heavier, mainly because they're heavier, but potentially if they're curved, that can make it harder as well.
I actually saw that video that you made back it was a while ago, but during my research, I actually watched a bunch of them, but that was one that's like, oh, of course, you can't turn and then try to parry that way because they'll just hit you.
But the funny thing is with the circular parry is that the main objection to doing it with saber is the fact that the sword's heavier and therefore you can't quite do it as deftly, as quickly as you can with a foil or a small sword. But if you're using a sword which is very manageable for you, so if to you it's a pretty light saber and you can move it quickly, but then you can use the circular, and to be honest, we do use circular parries with saber, not uncommonly actually. And Pedro, who's our probably highest meddling, him and Amir, we've got two quite well performing guys in my club, but Pedro uses circular parries, so he teaches foil and small sword as well, but he uses circular parries with saber very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, so at the Arnold tournament in March, so it was the first time I entered a saber tournament. I had never really seriously fenced saber before, but I went in there essentially using the saber as a small sword. So I was primarily thrusting. Although I mean I've done Messer and I've done Bolognese, so I know how to cut as well. But I was primarily, and I did find myself using a lot of kind of circular parries. But then also it was very interesting. I was very, very thrust heavy, and for a lot of people, they were not thrusting hardly at all, and they're just coming at you with cuts, and they just make a big preparation and just stop thrust. And it was interesting to see how frustrating that was.
I'm just gonna grab a sword from behind me that's quite pertinent to this topic.
Here we go. This is gonna be my favorite part of the whole show right here, guys.
I'm excited.
So this is a sword that belonged to the Colonel of the Scots Guards in the 1870s, and it is a triangular small sword blade on a saber hilt. And I have an original picture from that period of him in his fencing gear.
Awesome.
So the fact is that if you want to use, officers could certainly get whatever blade they wanted. I've got other ones up here that are just straight thrusting blades. Even some regulation models, if you look at the French 1882 model, then it's a thrusting sword. You know, you can cut with it, but it's a tapered, narrow, pointy skewer, basically. And this is what they moved more towards the end of the 19th century. So I think if you're looking at Louis Rondel, then 100%, something that's really quite light at the tip and pointed and narrow, and primarily a thrusting blade that you have some cutting capacity with, is completely accurate for that.
Well,
I have
actually,
questions for you, Matt.
oh, go ahead.
So with Messer, there's a lot of David had brought up Messer. There's a lot of wrestling involved, and there is even some in rapier, not a ton, but there's some. In the Saber manuscripts, like, or the source material, is it fairly prevalent, or is it not really brought up?
There's almost none. So the exception is Hutton's manual I talked about, where you're in the depths of Afghanistan and defending your life against a tribesman with a tulwar and a shield. And in that, he uses grips, and that's pretty much as far as it gets. He uses grips to control the opponents, mostly their sword arm, in order to either sort of hamstring them or to thrust them up close or pommel them or whatever. So there are closes, but there is no real wrestling. Now, this is a question that I get asked a fair amount, is why isn't there more corps à corps, as it were, in the 19th century material? And I think we know that it happened. So it is mentioned in historical sources as actually happening kind of like on the battlefield. But I think that it didn't happen in the fencing cells for a couple of reasons. Number one, it wasn't allowed usually. But number two, I think when you have a lunge and recover system like small sword or saber, it's less likely to happen because your left foot isn't coming forwards very often. And so you're pretty much always dominant side presented. And I think they were taught pretty much that if someone tries to close, you either run them through as quickly as you can, or you counter that and then run them through. So it's kind of more centric on the blade and less on the body. Why that was, I mean, I think it's the footwork is part of it, the lunge and recover. I think perhaps a little bit cultural as well. Cyril Mathy, who was Hutton's best friend, he writes, so he was the person that rediscovered George Silver and got it republished in the end of the 1800s. And he talks a little bit about, in his prologue to it, he talks about the fact that, in the old days they used to teach fighting, and these days we teach fencing. And he's saying that we should get back to teaching something a bit more combative. And this, of course, is exactly what Hutton went on to do in 1897 when he brought out this How to Fight an Uncivilized Enemy appendix to his manual. And so I think there was a movement back towards including some of this kind of stuff right at the end of the 19th century. But of course, at the end of the 19th century, you've got the arrival of magazine bolt action rifles, you've got machine guns becoming more common, and World War I comes along. So I think that the changes in warfare meant that this stuff never kind of reached its full kind of revival, as it were. And I know that John Clements, for example, I name drop John Clements. John Clements always used to say that Hema revival died out because of World War I. Well, this period is kind of my specialism in terms of what I have been studying for the last 10 years. And actually, all the evidence points to me that it died out before World War I. So it wasn't World War I that killed off. So I think he made the assertion that it killed a lot of the officers who were engaged in this Hema revival. But that's not actually true. Most of the people who were engaged in the Hema revival were too old to serve in World War I. Unfortunately, the Hema revival just died out. It just petered out because there just wasn't a huge amount of interest in fencing, certainly not in military fencing at the end of the 19th century. And actually, ironically, what revived fencing as a thing was the Olympics in 1904. And that's why we now have this separate thing that is Olympic fencing and and Hema, because what was Hema became Olympic fencing and was changed inextricably because it was no longer seen as a military necessity. It was now seen as just a sport. So I think I don't know why there wasn't more close-in stuff, but there is some. But it's mostly about commanding the opponent's weapon. So grabbing their arm, grabbing their hilt, sometimes grabbing their blade. And we do see, the other point I try to make as well is, you have to remember that most people using a sword on foot on a 19th century, in a 19th century conflict, wouldn't be fighting another person with a sword. They'd be fighting someone with a bayonet. because the only people with swords on foot usually were officers, and most of the men had a rifle or a musket with a bayonet on the end. So in fact, if you now look at the sword versus bayonet material, you see absolutely loads of grabbing and closing, because the best way to fight against someone with a bayonet or a spear is to get control of the point, grab the weapon, and close in as quickly as you can. So we do see more closing and grabbing and disarming and stuff like this in the sword versus bayonet material.
I have 3 comments. 1, can we please bring a single stick back to the Olympics?
And to the White House.
They did foil, saber, and single stick, I believe, right? But do we know if it was actually like single stick or if it was something like lacan? I've heard some discussion about what it actually was.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's not something. I think Maxime Chunod up in Canada, he's done some research into that. I'm not 100% sure. I suspect that it was in the 1904 Olympics. I suspect it was basket hilted single stick, which, it has to be said, was still practiced in the military in Britain until after World War II. So in the Navy and in the Royal Marines, it was still practiced until the 1950s, and there were still, there were medals and there were cups and tournaments and everything. And in fact, a lot of people involved in the early Hema movement, the modern Hema movement in the 1990s in the UK, were people who were at Edinburgh University and studied under a guy called Professor Bracewell. And Professor Bracewell was one of the last fencing instructors who had a continuous lineage of learning of single stick. And so at Edinburgh University, he was teaching people single stick, and these people included people like Dr. Milo Thurston, Paul MacDonald, Guy Windsor, various other people, who were related to that kind of Edinburgh scene, which is where a lot of the modern Hema in the UK started out.
Interesting. Oh, what was your third one?
Yeah, well, that was my first. My second one. I think just in talking about the grappling and closing, I do think modern people have a very, I think, influenced by probably the popularity of MMA and things like that, of this idea of that all combat is like absolutely no holds barred. Like in a real fight, you just do whatever it takes to win. And I think people don't understand how much cultural just expectations can really come into play. Pietro Monte, who I think his book is very, very, very late 15th century, is Collectanea. He spends a ton of time discussing how different countries fight and what they do and what they don't do and what they think is like unmanly, and it's very interesting to read. Because he talks a lot about how the cultural differences really do affect the fighting. So I think that's something that, and you kind of mentioned this as well, but I think that's something that people really modern people don't tend to really have that understanding.
I think that's completely correct. What's interesting in the 19th century, obviously I mostly study British sources, but some of this would also go for French and Italian and others as well. They did do lots of boxing. Okay, so they did lots of pugilism, and certainly in the British text, they kind of consider that if you have to fight without a weapon, then boxing's going to be the way you're going to do it, and that's how you're going to defend yourself. But they also, let's just talk about the afterblow for a moment, because in the 19th century sources, when they talk about how to fence and they talk about rules and how to score things, they repeatedly say that if a person gets hit, you should stop, and there shouldn't be an afterblow allowed. Now and the reason they give is so Waite actually specifically says, he says it's because when a person's cut or thrust, you don't know that they would even be able to fight after that. They might be able to, of course. In fact, there's a very good chance that they will continue fighting, as we would all probably agree from a modern Hema's perspective. But from a Victorian perspective, their view was like, if you run someone through the body or you cut them across the arm or the neck or the leg or whatever, then they're not going to be able to fight very effectively after that point. So they're assuming that the wound is going to be effective somehow. But what's interesting is the fact that so many people have to mention that in their manuals tells us that clearly some people were giving a blow after they'd been hit. Yeah, because it's human nature. You're like, I'm not gonna, that wasn't a good one, I'm gonna give you a good one. And we know there are newspaper accounts of, particularly of single stick bouts, where they go, the foil fencers came on and showed magnificent precision and skill, and then the saber players came on and it was a bit rough and brutal, and then the single stickers came on, and the single stickers, they just thrashed each other with sticks and there was no art to it and blah blah blah. So there was definitely a cultural bias at that time that messy fighting was sort of brutish and unattractive, and that the very tidy foil fencers, who by modern standards would be probably regarded as like classical fencing, they were doing it by the book. It wasn't just about winning. You had to win it the way that you were supposed to win it, using the correct, perfect technique, and your lunge must be artistically perfect, and your rear leg must be straight or it wouldn't be counted, and this kind of stuff.
I got this mental image of somebody like holding up like one of the plates and just being like, well, your knee is just a little bit.
But interestingly, so I read a lot of accounts that are combat accounts from India, Afghanistan, China, parts of Africa, this kind of stuff. And what's interesting as well is actually how rarely they describe an opponent in those places as grappling. Because in most situations, the opponents that they were fighting in close combat were using a sword of some kind, be it a tulwar or a kaskara or a kaiba knife or whatever, and a shield in the other hand, or a spear and a shield. And actually, that doesn't leave any hands free for grappling. And you just don't. There just aren't many accounts of any grappling happening in combat accounts in the 19th century. So we could say it's a kind of European 19th century kind of way of viewing combat, but actually that seemed to be the case in Asia and Africa and other places as well, that actually grappling didn't necessarily happen a lot in combat. But that's a massive topic, and trying to unpack why do we see so much grappling in medieval and Renaissance sources and so little grappling in any other. I mean, for example, we go to classical Rome and Greece, we don't read, yes, they had their wrestling styles, but you very rarely hear about wrestling happening during a combat involving weapons. Usually the fight is with the weapons and it's ended with the weapons. There's not normally any grappling.
I wonder if it would have something to do with fencing masters using their treatises as kind of like portfolios, showing all the different things that they can teach you and all the things that they know, versus in the 19th century, that's not really the purpose of those manuscripts. It's much more utilitarian and like, here's what really happens in real life and all that kind of stuff.
I think that's probably partly the explanation. For example, if we look at the Bolognese manuals, how much wrestling is there in the Bolognese manuals? Really practically none, except for when you're defending yourself against a knife. Right. And we look at 19th century manuals that talk about defense against knife, and they also, Hutton literally copies Marozzo. So we accept that if you're fighting unarmed against a dagger or a knife, then that's going to involve wrestling and grappling.
You got to be so close anyways.
Yeah, but it's interesting as well, because aside from the kind of, I guess, the knightly sources of like Fiore and Vardi, and then plus the German traditions, the factual traditions, and then I suppose you could see people like Petter and Passion in the Netherlands of the 17th century as a follow-on to that. If we go into the Italian Renaissance sources, whether it's the Bolognese 16th century stuff, or whether it's the later the rapier kind of period, the sort of later 16th and 17th century stuff, and certainly the small sword stuff, there isn't very much grappling in it. There's a bit, but there isn't very much. So I wonder also if it's partly a fencing culture thing, because a lot of the treatises, certainly for the 15th and 16th centuries that we work from, are German factual kind of origin sources, and they seem to have taught wrestling and all the weapons all together in the same place. So I guess they combined the things. Maybe it's related to armor as well. Maybe that's because in armored fighting there is inevitably going to be wrestling, because you're invulnerable to certain types of attack, and maybe therefore when they were training people in these German Fechschule, maybe they wanted to make sure they put lots of wrestling in, because the tradition they came from was this kind of, being able to fight in armor or out of armor or whatever. I don't know, I'm just guessing, but it seems possible.
That was related basically to my third point, was I think one of the reasons you see so much grappling in the medieval sources is because of armor. Because from my experience in doing armored combat, you always end up wrestling, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you almost always end up wrestling, because
it's like impossible to hurt you from a distance.
Well, or to hurt someone to a degree that they cannot continue.
Yeah.
You might wound them, but that doesn't mean you're going to stop them necessarily.
There's this technique in Fiore's Polak section, which is it's the most unnecessary use of space in a fencing treatise I think that I've ever seen, where he's literally like, right, so this is the technique. You hit the guy in the head with your poleaxe, and then you hit him again, and then you hit him again, and if he hasn't fallen over, you drop your poleaxe and you grab him by the helmet and pull him to the floor. It's like did you actually really need to tell us that?
Like one of my favorite techniques from the Kushner's Messer is when he's talking about half swording, and he has one where you half sword and you strike to the head so that they kind of reel back, then you strike to the body so that they come forward, and then back to the neck.
Nice.
It's so over the top, but it's so
very realistic.
I noticed one a bit like that the other day in Paulus Hector Maya with a flail, I think it was, threshing, like a thresher, and I'd never really looked at the translation of this, but it looks like a guy bending over and being hit on the butt with a flail, and it's one of these images that get used in a lot of memes because it just looks really funny. But I didn't realize, of course, that he's hit. I think he's. I can't remember now, but he's like let the guy swing by or something. There's some slightly more complex explanation for why this guy's bending over double and being hit on the back with a flail. But yeah,
there's a late 16th century treatise, like it's German treatise that includes longsword and dussack and pole arms, and it's called it's interesting because it's called like the second book on this like art-rich fencing. We don't have the first book, but it's very interesting, and it shows all these like big, really beefy guys with like fetters cutting each other. There's like blood spraying everywhere and stuff like that. But there's a fantastic technique with the dussack where like you parry and like press, and then with the back edge you come under, and it says you give them I can't remember what the word is. It's like a scandia or something. And I looked it up, and it literally is you're hitting them in the balls.
Yeah.
But it's like intentionally with the back edge of the sack, and it's purely like just
like a flick.
A flick, and it's not really anything other than to like to embarrass your opponent.
There's a couple. What's that that Hans disarm that he always Hans Heimer, the disarm that he always teaches, the backwards
ringing his bells.
Yeah.
What is that from? Is that from Le Kushner?
Yeah, it's from the Kushner.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of my favorite dagger techniques to demonstrate in classes from Fiore is the stab comes down like this, and you deflect it to the side and then carry it around between the person's legs, and then you grab the hand from behind, then you move around so you've got their one hand with both, and then you pull up and the person goes like tumbles over. It's just really fun because you can do it quite safely as well, because you're basically lifting the person with their arm between legs.
Okay, so I have to say, if we want to talk about the Kvetun Easton saber, we should probably talk about it. But
Cool.
is there anything that we want to go over before we move on?
I'm good.
Cool. All right. All right. So let's talk about the Kvetun Easton saber, and it's now I think in the third iteration. Yes. Very cool. So to start off, tell us a little bit how that collaboration came about.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we were in the early days of doing Saber and trying to get more serious about it. One of the first barriers we ran up against was that the practice sabers we had available to use were crap. The Hanway Hutton was just horrible. I'd been handling antique sabers for years, so I knew what they should feel like. And the Hanway Hutton was not it. It didn't feel right in the hand at all. And also the production quality was terrible. They were very flimsy. The other models that were available also from Hanway were of Italian style, much narrower bladed, and that wasn't really what we wanted at that time. Well, nothing against them, it wasn't a good simulator for what we needed. So I started looking around for people that could make a saber, and the first one that I came up with was Peter Regnier with Regnier Armory. And so the reason this is called a Mark III is because there were two Marks before this. And the Mark I was the Regnier Easton saber. And that was quite different to this, although it had a hilt which was a bit similar to this, but the blade was flat. So as a lot of viewers will know, Peter Regnier's swords, which have a very good reputation for being robust and everything else. And at that time, he was the standard producer really for feathers. And that's why I went to him, because he had a good reputation for consistency. And I knew him as well. I'd known him for a few years from European events. And so we built that. And for a year or so, we were quite happy with those. But then basically he had outsourced production of the guards because he is not a sheet metal worker. So he had a guy who, I believe, I'm not 100% sure I'm correct on this, but if I remember correctly, he had a guy making these who was an armor maker. And that person basically either decided to stop making them or moved on and did other things or whatever. So he lost the ability to make the guards. And so for a certain period of time, sabers just went out of production. And then he got someone who could make a new type of guard, which is the type he now has in production. But instead of reviving the old models of saber that had been available, he brought out these new models, and we didn't really like how they handled. We found them a little bit clunky, a little bit heavy, and we just thought that we could come up with something better. So the next company I worked with was Red Dragon, which is the Night Shop, who make the nylon swords. And I know those guys very, very well. They come to all of the events I run, and they always trade and that kind of stuff. And obviously what they produced was made out in India. So it was made to lower production quality control, lower consistency, should we say. However, when they were good, they were really quite good. And we really, really liked how they handled. They were a little bit more crudely made than the Regnier ones, but they handled fantastically. And when they were good, they were good. The problem was that the quality control wasn't 100% on them. And we occasionally used to get ones that would break straight away, or that would bend, were too soft. And a batch of those did go out to Swordfish one year. They were the kind of regulation Swordfish saber, and unfortunately the entire batch failed. So we just decided to just pull production because the manufacturer in India wasn't able to guarantee good enough quality control. And then we kind of went for probably about 2 years where we didn't really have anyone that we could buy sabers from that we really liked. I was personally in a lucky position in that I had a kind of stockpile of old sabers, old Regnier Eastern Mark I's, as well as the Red Dragon sabers, because I'd been sent so many prototypes for testing that I had basically a a garage full of sabers to use. So it wasn't a problem for me personally, but for other people in my club, there would always be like, well, where should I get my saber from? And I'd be like, Regnier, just kind of. So we ended up with lots of different makes in the club. Anyway, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, Kvetun, or Kvetun, depending how you pronounce it, kind of exploded onto the scene. And I was kind of relatively early on, I started seeing their stuff around in the club and at events and stuff, and I was really quite impressed. And so I got in contact with them and opened up the dialogue to talk about developing a new saber. And Alex at Kvetun is, without a shadow of a doubt, they're the best product development company I've ever worked with. There is a missing link in here, which I don't talk about publicly very often, but I'll tell you guys, there was another company I tried to develop a saber with. In fact, there were two other companies that I tried to develop sabers with in this period. One produced really nice ones, very, very nice ones, but then I requested some changes, and when they sent the next prototypes, they changed way more than I had asked for them to change. It's like they just kind of went on their own journey of what they thought, and I was just like, I can't handle this. And they'd taken a long time to do that as well. Another company I had great hopes for, which are actually quite a well-known knife-making company, who I won't name. They produced a couple of prototypes that were so bad that I just basically emailed them the next day.
Yeah.
And I was like, these are crap, and I listed all of the reasons why they were bad and said, I'm really sorry, but I'm not even going to try. And these are so bad, I think we should just call it quits here and move on.
Oh, no.
Everything about them was wrong. So yeah, but anyway, Kvetun were brilliant, and they took on the most important element, the thing which I'd wanted to do for years, and that was this hollow ground blade, which I certainly wasn't the first person to champion this style of a blade. It's actually something which Pavel Mok had been doing on feathers for quite a few years, actually. So some feather manufacturers had done this, but no saber manufacturers had. And critically, the reason that I championed this blade cross-section is not only for the practical benefits of it, but because the British 1864 practice saber has a blade exactly like this, and I own several original examples. So I literally sent detailed measurements, all the way up the blade, thicknesses at different points, and all this kind of stuff, weight distribution to Kvetun, and they reproduced it, and they did a brilliant job. And in the prototype testing stage, Kvetun also kind of earned their accolades by the fact that we found that 1 in 4 blades were breaking. And we were like, for every 4 swords we get, 1 of them is snapping. Why is that happening? And they eventually worked it out because they had a micro fracture in their heat treatment oven. And they were putting blades into the heat treatment oven in batches of 4. And the blade that was near the crack in the oven was getting an inconsistent heat. So that's how, these guys, I don't know any other manufacturer that I've worked with that would have nailed that down, why that was happening,
That is pretty incredible, actually.
And they just fixed the problem. So I'm not saying that, these are infallible, but the other thing with Kvetun is they give a 1-year guarantee, which is, great, really, for a Hema sword that gets quite a lot of abuse.
Yeah.
The hilts aren't perfect. There are some things that even at this stage, I would prefer to change a little bit about the hilts. The guard sticks out a little bit too far from the grip, according to my preferences. But some people I know like to use quite big gloves.
Yeah, I was going to say, it must be the gloves.
You do need some people I know would prefer the grip to be a bit longer. Personally, that's one of the things I didn't like about the Regnier sabers. I find the grips too long. But again, different strokes for different folks, and I just have to accept at the end of the day, this is my design and this is mostly my preferences. So the thing is, if someone wants a longer grip, they can just ask Kvetun for a longer grip. Equally, if they want a backstrap, they can have a backstrap. If they want a different shaped grip, they can have a different shaped grip. So what
about a thumb ring?
Yeah, I mean, you could put a thumb ring in there. You could put a finger ring in there.
Finger
So
ring.
there are some Portuguese sabers have a finger ring inside.
Oh
so
yeah.
there's all sorts of stuff you could do with these. But at the end of the day, what we've ended up with is something that is functionally almost identical in weight and balance and the way it moves in the hand to the original British Army practice sabers of the mid to late Victorian period. And in quality, it's better than they were, and it has some improvements. It has a slightly nicer grip than those originals do. It has this reinforced rib around the edge of the guard, which the originals don't have. And the originals, the guards are often bent and chopped up on the edges because they don't have this reinforced rib. And very importantly as well, we've got a more blunt point on the end than the originals have. The originals are just literally spatulate rounded points, which pretty nasty, being thrust in the ribs with one of those. I know some people prefer a thickened point to a rolled tip. Personally, I've never had any problems with rolled tips, but there we go.
Actually, that was going to be my next question, because it comes with 3 different kinds of tips, I believe, and it's a rolled, it's a regular blunted, and a spatulated. Is that right?
It might do. I mean, to be honest, so my design is with the rolled tip.
Okay.
So Kvetun, if Kvetun offer other options, that's their choice, really.
Yeah, I think that there is a just a general movement, and maybe I'm reading the Saber community wrong, or maybe I'm a little bit too much in the Dussac community, but there's some sort of, like, I don't know, dislike against rolled tips for some reason.
So the reason that I'm aware of that people don't like rolled tips is they have a tendency of getting caught on things in kit bags, for example, when you're pulling the sword out, and some of them snap off and break. Which obviously a swollen tip won't ever do that. The reason I like the roll tip is because it adds a greater surface area without adding greater mass. And my personal experience with flared tips, with Denellis, with Hanways, with various other things that have had a thickened section at the end, is it adds mass to the blade at the tip, which means that the tip hits harder, which, when you've got quite a light, fast accelerating blade, makes quite a big difference with something like a saber. But additionally, the thickened tip being heavier means the blade gets a bit more floppy, because when you're moving it around, you have more mass at the tip. The great thing about the rolled tip is it's hollow, so you're not adding any real mass.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you still put the blunted like rubber over top of it, or no?
No, we don't put anything on tips of these. We find these roll tips are absolutely fine safety wise as they are.
All right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think most of the problems I've seen with rolled tips has actually been with long swords, and it's actually more of an issue not with the rolled tip, it's with the stiffness of the blade. A rolled tip with a very stiff blade can punch through, I think, more easily. But again, that's not really the tip fault, it's the preference for really, really stiff fetters.
Yeah, so something related to that, which is specific to this design, is I specified how long that tip or how wide that tip had to be at the end. And if you look at Kvetun's side swords, some of their side swords are only about half that at the tip, and so the surface area is half. So for me, the main reason to have that of a certain width at the end is it means that the roll tip is a lot stronger, but also, of course, is doubling the surface area at the end, making it a lot safer. And I have seen a number of feathers from various manufacturers, feathers and side swords and rapiers, in fact, where the blade's so narrow at the end that the roll tip is tiny, which kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
So actually, since I asked you and you said that the rolled tip version was your design specifically, I think they're also offering the saber in different curvatures. Is that like a part of your design, or was that their own?
Yeah.
Oh,
no,
cool.
that was my idea. So I personally actually prefer. This is going to be controversial, but I prefer a straight blade. But that wasn't my design. So my original design was this one, which is slightly curved. And that basically is a replica of the originals. And it's similar to most of the Victorian officer sabers that we're simulating, basically. But I know that there's a huge market for blades that are more curved. And so I said to them right from the beginning, I said, we should do a more curved version as well, because some people like a saber to have real curves. Okay. But equally, I said, we may as well do a straight version as well, because the straight version is easier to make. And some people, the straight blades could be used on back swords, on spadroons, on all sorts of other sorts of things, which they're now doing. So, and then they sent me some prototypes, and this was a sort of accident. They sent me prototypes thinking that I wanted straight ones. I was expecting a bunch. I'd actually sold these as well to members of my club before they arrived, and everyone was like, why are these blades straight? we're expecting slightly curved ones, and they all turned up straight. But what's funny is at least half of us have actually ended up preferring the straight blades to the slightly curved ones, just simply because we find that you have slightly better point control. So in the bind, it's slightly nicer, basically, to be able to get the point online in binds. And to a certain extent, you have slightly more reach as well. And so the more a blade curves, the closer you have to be to the thing you're hitting. So if you've got a 34-inch straight blade, you're going to be able to reach from slightly further away than a 34-inch curved blade.
Yeah, I think so I don't know too much about it, but I think that the curvature of the blade is mostly for cutting, and the only real techniques that would change between a curved and a straight blade are, you can do some of the like false edge thrusts like around a defense, kind of, but
yeah,
is that the trade-off? Or
yeah, basically, yeah. So there are some lines of thrust you can get with a curved blade, and it's funny because I went from using a slightly curved blade to using a straight blade, and then after a certain amount of time, I went back to, for various reasons, I went back to using one of my older swords for a short period of time, and it was one of the old Kvetun sabers from before I developed one with them. And those blades have a somewhat strange curve in that they only curve slightly here, but then they curve quite aggressively in the last bit of the blade. And what was funny is, because I went back to using a curved blade, I suddenly realized I could stab people in the hands really, really often by coming around the side of their guard. And I hadn't really appreciated it until I went back to using a curved blade again. I was like, oh, this is fun. I'd forgotten about this.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what tournament it was. I think it was Surfo. There was a guy with like a talwar and a shield. It was, and I think his name was also David, and that's why it stuck out to me. But he ended up taking the silver. But that's what he did so much. He was very strong counterattack game, and then like stabbing the hands around, that I remember being very, very effective.
But for me personally, I find, so that is one nice thing of the curve. But I find, generally speaking, having a less curved or even a straight blade suits me better.
Interesting. All right. Well, we are obviously way over time, but I didn't want to cut this short at all because I am enjoying every minute of it. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that anybody wanted to touch on?
I was actually going to ask, just because we're in the U.S., do you know where we can get the Kvetun Eastern blade in the U.S.?
So is that because you can't import directly from Russia?
I think we can, but it's more expensive to do that, and I believe...
And our stuff is going to be held in customs for...
Yeah, last I checked, I think there might have been a reseller, but I'm not sure, so...
Yeah, so being completely straight up, so I don't actually get anything out of the sale of the Eastern Saber, but I get them at a special price. So that was what I negotiated with Kvetun. So I do, incidentally, I am working with other manufacturers on other things at the moment, including some sharp sabers for test cutting, including some new medieval replicas, and all sorts of stuff. But so I have different agreements and arrangements with different companies depending on what the things are. But with these sabers, my priority was just to get them made and get them out there and get them available, and kind of selfishly actually for my own club, because we just wanted the saber. We knew what sabers we wanted, and we just wanted to get them made, and good reliable ones.
I tell you, that's like 50% of Hema is wanting some sort of gear or sword that works and just not finding it ever anywhere. Like, no one's making this. It's so frustrating. So frustrating.
So in the UK, I have, well, in Europe, in fact, I have kind of the monopoly on reselling these. So you can buy them directly from Kvetun, but so far well, that was what I negotiated with them, basically, is that I had the reselling rights. However, that's not true of the US. So theoretically, I believe that anyone who stocks Kvetun stuff could get these in the US. So I guess you need to approach the people that sell Kvetun stuff and say, can you get some Eastern Sabers in? Now, I should add to that obviously, so I run my antique business and I ship a lot of stuff to the US. But for tax reasons, I have to keep things separate. So my antiques business is over here, my Hema, YouTube business is over there. I might possibly start reselling certain things myself, and if I do, then Kvetun sabers will be on the menu, and I can ship stuff to the US, no problem. The only problem is the cost and the tax and everything else. So.
I mean, I'm still game, honestly, because I really want one. It's just like, yeah.
And there are, not to undermine, there are other manufacturers of sabers out there, that are decent, but I have to say, for my personal tastes, there's no one except for Kvetun at the moment really making sabers that kind of meet what I want from a practice saber. And equally, it goes the other way for us, incidentally, in that there are some US and Canadian manufacturers of equipment, and we can't affordably buy that stuff either. It's like, for us to buy an Albion is super expensive because we have to pay the tax on top, when it comes in, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Albions are expensive anyway, but but when you add
oh man, actually, there was a meme going around. This was like 2 days ago about, it was like, you had $3,000 to spend at any store, but you only had an hour to do it. Could you do it? And like 6 of us were like, you could spend like 20 seconds on the Albion store. Spend that.
Yeah.
Buy 2 swords.
Yeah, you buy 2 swords.
The really sad thing is, though, you'd spend your $3,000 and then you'd have to wait about a year to get the thing.
that's the other half of the Hema struggle. Right there.
Although, being said, that's one of the best things about Albions, is that if you own one and you want to sell one, like in the US, you can sell it for almost any price. Like, hey, I can get it to you right away.
Well, I have owned Albions that I've sold, but I've probably owned about 6 or 7 Albions, and I think only one of them I've bought brand new. Every single one of them I bought secondhand, and they were all in basically perfect condition because they've just sat on someone's wall, or they've cut bottles once or twice with them and then put them on. So
also, if you buy an Albion, you buy the care package that comes with it, with the oil and you go the whole 9 yards. All right, well, I think that's pretty much it. Matt, thank you so much for coming on. This was an amazing discussion.
Me. It's an honor.
Yeah, we're the ones truly honored. But for the last thing, please tell our listeners at home again where to find you on the interwebs.
So you can find me at Scholar Gladiatoria channel on YouTube, and I've got my own website which you can find links to everything. So it's matteaston.co.uk, and if you just search for Matt Easton on Google, you'll find me in all those places.
He is relatively famous.
I've been spamming the internet for a couple of decades, so I'm fairly. I don't think I can ever hide now from anyone.
well, thanks again, and I guess I'll see everybody from our hosts next week. Bye.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.